Members could just take their seats, please. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Minister for Health. Why are up to half of all older Australians in residential aged care malnourished?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to address this very clearly.
Members will cease interjecting. The Minister has the call. The Minister has the call.
Thank you very much. The government called a royal commission, and it was one of the first acts of the Prime Minister on coming to office, precisely because we were concerned about the circumstances of Australians in aged care. And when the Prime Minister called this, he said that we had to be prepared for findings which would be of concern, which would be something which would confront all of us. And so it was done without fear or favour, just so as to bring to light all of the issues which need to be brought. The Royal Commission, and I thank the Commissioners, and sadly we have lost Commissioner Tracy, found very clearly that there were flaws in the system dating back not just over 3 or 5 years, but over recent decades. And we have moved to address those issues. In particular, over $500 million was allocated as part of the response to the first part of the Royal Commission. In addition to that, we've been supporting both home care as well as residential care. In particular, we have increased from $13.3 billion when we came into office the amount of funding to almost $22 billion, $23 billion, $24 billion and $25 billion over the course of the current budget. So let us be absolutely clear. We thank the Royal Commission for their findings. We embrace what they have found. We called that out, and any other findings we also embrace. That's why we established not just a Royal Commission, but a commissioner, a permanent standing commissioner, responsible for health and safety in aged care. And these are the actions that we've taken. As I say, increasing not just in residential care, but also in home care, the support, the encouragement and the protections, and we will continue to do that without fear or favour.
The member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment, representing the Minister for Women. Will the Minister outline how the Morrison government's commitment to ensuring equality in the workplace is benefiting women across Australia?
The Minister for the Environment has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Lindsay for her question and congratulate her on leading the W21 think tank program, a global women's initiative at the US Study Centre. And she, like so many of the class of 2019 on both sides of the House, the female class of 2019, will make an extraordinary contribution to this parliament. Mr Speaker, while acknowledging that we have further to go, it is important to also recognise how far we've come. Our mothers and grandmothers talked not about the gender pay gap, but about the opportunity to be in the workforce at all. Until 1966, women had to resign from the public service when they got married, the lifetime of many of the people in this parliament. And while women still battle discrimination, it's different than it was before. In my own field of aviation, Mr Speaker, I well recall Debbie Wardley, a pilot who took Ansett Airlines to court based on her determination to fly in the left-hand seat of a commercial airliner. And the case against Debbie Wardley was that women were unsuitable to fly commercially. Their menstrual cycles made them unsuitable. They didn't have the strength to, for example, manually lower the landing gear in the event of a hydraulic failure. And in the year that Debbie Wardley won the case, she inspired an awful lot of women to fly aircraft, and I was one of them. We are supporting more women into leadership positions in the public and private sector, including meeting our own gender diversity targets of women holding 50% of Australian government board positions overall, and we're at 47.9%, and that's the highest we have been. And since 2013, we have reduced the gender pay gap to just 14%. It's come down by 3% since 2013. So this government is making real progress. And that is, as the Prime Minister said, the highest percentage of women in government boards since public reporting began. I know the Minister for Women in the other place is determined to get that number down. As I said, the gender pay gap is shrinking, and in 2018 we, for the first time, produced a Women's Economic Security Statement, because we recognise that strong correlation between a country's progress in closing the gender gap and its economic competitiveness, its national productivity, its innovation, its economic growth and the ability of companies to attract and retain talent. We're building on investments such as Women in STEM, entrepreneurship through the Curious Minds Future Female Entrepreneurs, and boosting female founders programs. And many of the high-paying jobs of the future will be in these sectors and will benefit the whole of society. There are incredible women, particularly, I must say, in rural Australia. They tend to hide their light under a bushel, but I just want to say to them all today, in fact, women everywhere who are in leadership positions, the generation coming behind you, they can't be what they can't see. So step out and shine your light.
The Minister's time has concluded. And I call the member for Franklin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. The median waiting time for the highest level of approved home care packages is almost 3 years. And the Aged Care Royal Commission found people who waited more than 6 months for a home care package had a 20% higher risk of death. Why on earth are older Australians facing a 3-year delay when the Minister knows it increases their risk of death?
The Minister for Health has.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for her question. The Royal Commission did make findings and we responded, rapidly. That included 10,000 additional home care places, which has been part of a 44,000 place increase in the last year and a half and a tiny bit more. And it's very interesting because what we have done is we have taken the number of home care places from 60,000 when we came to office to 150,000 now. That is a 150% increase. That is a dramatic increase in the number of home care places. And at the last election, I note that the opposition had a chance to contribute to the number of home care places, and they provided zero home care places. So at a time when we have added 44,000, in the last 2 years, at a time when we have increased by 150% the number of home care places, they added zero at the very moment. At the very moment they had the chance to take a stand, to invest a dollar. At the time they were raising $387 billion in taxes, and they provided zero, not one extra home care places. So we have invested and increased by 150% the number of home care places. They had a chance only a few months ago to do this, at a time when we had called a Royal Commission, when they knew that there were
Minister will resume his seat. The Minister will resume it. Has the Minister concluded his answer? Yes, the member for Longman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's consistent beliefs and policies are ensuring it delivers on its commitments to Australians? Is the Prime Minister aware of the effects of any alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister has the call.
The last election, we went to the last election, Mr Speaker, as a government, and we went there with our clear beliefs, and they were a fair go for those who have a go, that the best form of welfare is a job, Mr Speaker, and that you don't have to hold people down in order for others to be able to succeed, Mr Speaker. These are the beliefs that underpin the commitments we took to the Australian people at the last election, and then they endorsed those beliefs by returning the members of this government and electing some outstanding new members to sit on these government benches so we could go forward and implement the commitments that we made. And, Mr Speaker, we said we wanted to lower taxes. That's what we said at the election, not increase taxes, as the Labor Party said they wanted to do at the election. We said we wanted to lower taxes, and within weeks of sitting as a government from the last election, we legislated, Mr Speaker, to lower taxes. But what was the alternative? The Leader of the Opposition, the Labor Party, were against lowering taxes, and they were for lowering taxes, Mr Speaker. Each way, every day on lower taxes is what you find from the Labor Party. We said, Mr Speaker, that we wanted to legislate the drought fund because we knew that those right across rural and regional Australia who are hurting from the drought needed that drought support that was determined at the National Drought Summit. We took it to the Australian people. The Leader of the Opposition was against it, was for it, Mr Speaker, taking each position he possibly could on this issue. On affordable energy, Mr Speaker, what we have done has been putting in place the policies we took to the last election to ensure that we were supporting the generation of power across our economy and not having any allergies to the source of that energy whatsoever. Whether it was on renewable energy, whether it was on pumped hydro, whether it was on ensuring that we had coal-fired power stations in the north with the feasibility study, whatever it is, Mr Speaker, we know it's necessary to generate jobs. Those opposite, and in particular the Leader of the Labor Party, Mr Speaker, cannot make up his mind what his policy is. He's going to go to Western Australia this week, Mr Speaker, and I assume as soon as he lands, the location services enabler will kick in, and all of a sudden he'll be for the resources sector. He'll be for the resources sector the second he touches down in Western Australia. But when he gets back to Victoria, I suppose, and he's round the suburbs of Victoria, the location services enabler will kick in again. He'll check his GPS and his language will change completely. Mr Speaker, consistency matters, and the Leader of the Opposition has—
Prime Minister resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
You finished? He's finished.
The member for Franklin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. The Minister just boasted about 10,000 more home care packages, only half of which are currently available. 28,000 older Australians died while waiting for their approved home care package in just 2 years. Surely Australians who've contributed all of their lives deserve better. Will the Minister admit now that 5,000 packages in response to a waiting list of over 112,000 amounts to neglect?
The Minister has the call.
Thank you very much. I want to respond to the member with a very clear position. What we have done based on advice as to what is both the safest way to implement, to respond rapidly and to respond to the Royal Commission. It was a Royal Commission which the Prime Minister called. It was a Royal Commission which he called as one of his first actions, precisely to bring to light all of the potential issues. And the Commission has done a fantastic job. And in responding and accepting all of the Commission's interim findings, we made 2 points in relation to home care. One, 10,000 places. Secondly, in addition to that, that's part of a 44,000 place increase in the last 2 years, or an increase from 60 to 150,000, 150% increase whilst we have been in government. But two, we also accepted their proposal for a broader strategic restructure, and we are working in preparing for that, but of course we will have to see what the Commission themselves recommends as their final recommendation. But we got on with it immediately. And I would remind the House that at the same time as we have increased by 150% home care places at a dramatically faster rate than the rate of older Australians has grown, which means we have a far higher per capita rate of home care places for older Australians than ever existed under Labor when they were in government. Labor had a chance during the course of the Royal Commission to match what we were doing, and they failed. 0 places, not one, not a dollar, 0 places on something that they now seem to believe matters after the Royal Commission had been called. I would call what they did at the last election neglect.
Just before it's the independence question, but just before I call the honourable member for Indi, I'd like to inform the House that we have present in the gallery this afternoon a former member of this House and current Deputy Leader of the Tasmanian Labor Party, Michelle O'Byrne. On behalf of the House, a welcome to you. The member for Indi.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, my constituents tell me they are outraged and disappointed by the sports rorts scandal. Many Australians would be shocked to know that the government's last model for the Federal Integrity Commission is so weak it would have been unable to investigate the former Minister for Sport for her role in the Sports Rorts debacle. Prime Minister, can you reassure us that the government's bill for a Federal Integrity Commission will give it the power to investigate scandals such as this?
The Attorney-General.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So, as the member I think is aware, because of multiple briefings that we've had together, the model that we are proposing, and as I say, it's very complicated, but 350 pages of draft.
Members
today,
on my left.
But the model that we are proposing would have powers greater, standing powers greater than a Royal Commission. So both on the law enforcement integrity side and the public sector integrity side, the powers that would be available to the Commonwealth Integrity Commission under our design would be greater than those that would exist for a Royal Commission. So this, in effect, would be a standing powers of a Royal Commission that would be able to investigate known offences such as abuse of public office, but other criminal offences relating to corruption, right across the public sector, on one side for law enforcement agencies and on the other side for other agencies. I might note that there was nothing in the recent report of the Auditor-General that suggested anything of the nature that I think was inferred in the question. In fact, the Auditor-General's report made it very, very clear that every single one of the projects that was ultimately approved, pursuant to guidelines whereby the minister had ultimate discretion, was an eligible project. I hear interjections from members opposite, but it was also the case that in previous grants programs there were multiple approvals of grants which were actually ineligible, grants programs indeed overseen by the Leader of the Opposition. There was nothing of that nature in the Auditor-General's report here, nothing of that nature. But what's also clear is that under our model, if an Auditor-General who would be a key referring agency ever took a view in any circumstances that there was the potentiality of an offence having been committed of any type, he could refer that matter up to the Commonwealth Integrity Commission, which would have powers greater than a Royal Commission to investigate.
And I call the member for Cooper.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. The Aged Care Royal Commission drew attention to inadequate prevention and management of wounds, sometimes leading to septicemia and death, and aged care residents sitting or lying in urine and faeces. Why are older Australians suffering from this neglect?
I'll call the minister. I just say to the House, the call should have gone to this side after the independence question, but I'll just make it up if that's okay. The minister has the call.
The Royal Commission's report was absolutely confronting, and it talked about neglect over decades. It talked about the situation which needed to be addressed, and that is why we adopted every one of the Royal Commission's findings, to remind that every one, not only did we call the Royal Commission, not only was this one of the Prime Minister's first actions, the opposition have staged and shown an utter hypocrisy in their approach today, and that is because when they had a chance only a few months ago.
The minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. This is a serious question.
No, what's the point of order?
Well, the point of order is on relevance. It wasn't about the opposition. We can't fund things from opposition.
The Leader of the Opposition
only the
will
government
resume his seat. The minister has the call. I'm listening.
Thank you very much. And in terms of those recommendations, not only have we adopted all of the findings of the interim report, but it stands in stark contrast to the utter hypocrisy and failure of the opposition. Given a chance only a few months ago, they could have provided one. How many home care places did they provide? 0. Now, in terms of the other items within the Royal Commission, it is an uncomfortable truth for the opposition. They had a chance and their provision was 0. But in terms of all of the findings of the Royal Commission—
Minister will resume his seat. Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition has already raised a point of order under relevance. I'm listening carefully. So you can't raise another point of order on relevance. You can't under the standing orders.
The point of order is he's defying your ruling. He is not speaking. The question did not go to alternatives at all. It's a serious question. It wasn't a politically laden question. It was a straight question.
Members on my right, the Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. Members on both sides will cease interjecting. I haven't called the minister. Members, the Manager of Opposition Business. I'm just going to say I do follow these questions very carefully. I understand the point the Leader of the Opposition is trying to make, and I've made that point when there's been very specific questions that don't ask for alternatives, that don't have political commentary in them. When a question has as its final line a line that's really sort of going to the criticism or talking about neglect, it does open things up somewhat. But I do say to the minister, the question didn't ask for alternatives. Ministers are allowed to compare and contrast briefly, but the question went very much to the government's approach, and I'm going to call the minister.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and you are correct. There were no alternatives. And so on that front, in terms of the safety and quality, very important reforms which we have enacted with regards to the Commission, obviously $496 million for the 10,000 home care packages. Very importantly, though, as well, $25.5 million to improve medication management and safety for older Australians living in residential aged care, as well as the $10 million for workforce training and support, particularly in dementia, and $4.7 million to improve the implementation of younger people in residential care. And in addition to that, what may have been lost by the opposition is that on the 1st of July, thanks to the work of the now Minister for Indigenous Affairs, new quality and safety standards for aged care came into being. And on the 1st of January, what we also had was a legislated Quality and Safety Commissioner in aged care, Janet Anderson, who, with her legislative powers, has now been pursuing these issues. So these are standards of safety, of care, whether it's in relation to wound management or falls or any other form of abuse or treatment, have never been legislated to this effect before, have never been taken to this level before, have never been elevated to the level of scrutiny which we have put in place on our watch, in our time, precisely because, as the Prime Minister said when he set out the need for a Royal Commission, we want to expose all of the challenges wherever they exist, whenever they occur, and in whatever form that may be.
The member for Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister outline to the House the importance of the Morrison government's consistent belief and policy approach to driving development in regional Australia? And is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of the consequences of alternative approaches?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Flynn for his question. Mr Speaker, he understands, coming from the wonderful port city, that industrial city of Gladstone, Mr Speaker, just how important our resource sector is. And he understands that coal provides $62 billion worth of exports. He understands that it provides 2/3 of Australia's energy supplies. He understands that it provides 55,000 jobs. And he understands the importance of the $4 million Collinsville feasibility study for that Healy plant. Mr Speaker, Gladstone has the NRG, Gladstone Power Station, Queensland Alumina, Cement Australia, Orica, Yarwun Global Chemical Plant, Northern Oil Refinery, a wonderful, wonderful business, Curtis Island, gas export facilities and pipelines. They're providing a lot of jobs, a lot of hope and optimism and opportunity. Mr Speaker, last night the well-informed Peter Van Odsel had a report about a rebel group. And when I heard this, Mr Speaker, I was very, very interested to see where rebel group was coming from, Mr Speaker. Initially I thought it might have been the Greens, Mr Speaker. I thought that the member for Melbourne, the former ALP branch member at Subiaco, Mr Speaker, might have had his come-to-Damascus moment. Mr Speaker, he's seeing the light shine in and knowing where that light came from. But then, Mr Speaker, I realised in fact it was the Otis Group, Mr Speaker, and Van Onselen belled the cat, Mr Speaker, about this rebel group. Imagine that, a rebel group within Parliament, Mr Speaker. You're just trying to steal my thunder. But Mr Speaker, I was very interested in reading the Otis menu, Mr Speaker. Very, very interesting reading. On the menu is ravioli egg yolk, and Mr Speaker, no doubt the leader of that group, the member for Hunter, Mr Speaker, he had that when he went there for dinner because today he's got egg all over his face, Mr Speaker. And
The Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. Member for Shortland's missing the moment yet again. I'm going to disappoint the Deputy Prime Minister. The question he got referred to alternative approaches. It's policy-based, so I can't see how reading out the menu, as interesting as it is relevant to the question. No, no. I'm not taking the risk. Just resume the seat. The Deputy Prime Minister has the call, and he needs to be relevant to the question. Can I say that doesn't involve reading out a restaurant menu?
Well, it didn't for the member for Maribyrnong, but I'm not quite sure that was on the menu. But, Mr Speaker, $100 million Gladstone Port Access Road extension. We're building the infrastructure that Gladstone needs and that the member for Flynn's people need. Mr Speaker, right across that wonderful central Queensland electorate, we're providing the infrastructure as part of our $100 billion infrastructure rollout, our decade-long plan. It's important, it's creating jobs, it's creating hope for the people of Flynn. The member for Flynn knows it. He knows how important our resources sector is. It's a shame those opposite don't. Ever-changing international cheese selection, just like their ever-changing policy position on coal.
I'm making up from the other question from before. The member for Bass.
Thank you. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer outline to the House how the Morrison government's consistent beliefs and economic management is keeping our economy resilient in the face of persistent challenges? Is the Treasurer aware of any alternative approaches that could threaten our economic prosperity?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bass for her question. She's been a farmer, a local mayor and a strong advocate, like the member for Braddon is, for the state of Tasmania, a state which has seen the strongest retail sales across the country, with turnover growing at 6.8% through the year to December, the strongest growth in retail sales in more than 5 years, Mr Speaker. Now, the Governor of the Reserve Bank has said that the economic fundamentals of this country are very strong. We have the first balanced budget in 11 years, Mr Speaker. We have a record number of Australians who are in work, Mr Speaker, and we have passed through the parliament, as a result of the last two budgets, more than $300 billion in tax cuts, Mr Speaker. Now, not everyone in this place has had a clear and decisive position when it comes to lower taxes, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition has been up and down like an Otis elevator, Mr Speaker. He has said when he was asked at a doorstop, after the tax cuts had passed, Labor initially stood in the way of the tax cuts, but you've ended up with those tax cuts anyway. Well, the Leader of the Opposition replied, no, he didn't. So the journalists asked him again. So you've had a win this week with the legislation that has passed the parliament. The Leader of the Opposition said, no, we didn't. We lost the vote, Mr Speaker. The journalists asked him again. how'd you lose the vote when you cast your vote with the government in the Senate? The Leader of the Opposition? No, he didn't. Mr Speaker, the reality is the Leader of the Opposition doesn't know what he stands for. He doesn't know what he votes for. No wonder there have been 20 MPs on the side opposite who have met in secret, not telling their leader, not telling their deputy, not telling their shadow treasurer, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, only this side of the House are committed to lower taxes and a stronger economy.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. And my question is addressed to the Minister for Health. Why do over 1/4 of younger people who go into aged care die within a single year of entry?
The Minister for Health.
In terms of individual cases, it would be very much dependent on the circumstances, because I would say this: younger people who go into aged care would be going in because they have a very serious condition, whether it's an acquired brain injury, whether it is some form of degenerative condition, whether it has been some other form of harm, whether through accident, injury or illness. So let us be very clear about that. Having said that, and I want to make this point, the person who wrote into the terms of the Royal Commission the involvement and engagement and treatment of younger people in residential aged care was this person, the Prime Minister. I had the privilege of sitting with him when we drafted those terms, and that was his personal passion. That was the focus and the humanity and the concern. Now, what we have also seen is that we have accepted the Royal Commission's embrace of those terms of reference. And in particular, there are 3 targets which the Royal Commission included in its interim findings precisely to address the care and concern and cause of any harm relating to young people in aged care. Firstly, that no people under the age of 65 should enter residential care by 2022. We have accepted and embraced that. Secondly, that no people under the age of 45 should be living in aged care by 2022, so living in, let alone entering. And thirdly, that no people under the age of 65 should be living in residential aged care by 2025. These are standards which have never been set before. These are goals which have never been set, and these are targets which have never been set and which we will achieve. And so it's a deep and powerful commitment. So I would make this point, that under the former government, the number of younger people living in residential aged care moved from 6,577 in 2007 to 6,478 in 2010. Now it is down to 5,606, and we are decreasing still further. It has become one of the priorities for the Prime Minister and the relevant minister, and what we have seen is that the number of younger people entering residential, so this is entering residential aged care, has also decreased from 536 in the March to June quarter of 2017 to 416 in the March to June quarter of 2019, a 22% decline before the Royal Commission's interim findings. So the reason that these standards have been set is because the Commission found the importance and need for them. But the reason the Commission had that power was because this person, the member for Cook, the Prime Minister of Australia, personally drafted them.
The member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the minister outline to the House the importance of the Morrison government's consistent beliefs and policy approach to energy investment? And is the minister aware of the consequences of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Energy and Emission Reduction.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. I acknowledge the extraordinary work she's doing in her electorate with technology entrepreneurs, clean technology entrepreneurs, who are bringing forward products and services to reduce emissions and reduce the cost of electricity across Australia and across the world, Mr Speaker. Now, we are focused on outcomes, lowering prices, keeping the lights on, bringing down emissions while we keep our economy strong, Mr Speaker, and that means doing all this without imposing a carbon tax, without driving up electricity prices and without hurting critical sectors that are the backbone of Australia, like agriculture, mining and manufacturing, Mr Speaker. Now, our approach to this is technology neutral because we're focused on the outcomes. We're getting on with getting more gas into critical markets like New South Wales. We're removing barriers to coal at places like Mount Piper, one of the newest and most flexible coal-fired generators in the country. We've put $1 billion into our grid reliability fund, Mr Speaker. We're supporting record levels of investment in renewable energy generation, and we're a world leader in renewable energy generation. And, Mr Speaker, we're investing in pump hydro projects like Snowy, Battery of the Nation and Mariners Link. We're also a world leader in energy efficiency and household solar, and we've backed the hydrogen sector with a commitment of over $500 million, Mr Speaker, and we're bringing all of this together with our technology investment roadmap. Now, Mr Speaker, our approach is balanced, it's sensible, it's technology neutral, and we have no policy allergies. No policy allergies. But the member for Higgins asked me if there was another approach. And there is, Mr Speaker, there is. It's called technology by town. Technology by town. Because when it comes to Labor, Mr Speaker, when they're in St Kilda, it's solar. When they're in Balmain, it's batteries. In Werribee, it's wind. But in Kingston, Mr Speaker, in Kingston, at the Otis Dining Hall, it's coal, Mr Speaker. It's all coal. Now, Mr Speaker, we don't do technology by town. We don't do technology by town. We'll support all technology that drives down the price of electricity, that keeps the lights on and that brings down emissions.
The member for Franklin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Why is the government privatising the aged care assessment team, the only part of the aged care system everyone accepts is working well, including the New South Wales Minister Brad Hazzard, who described this privatisation as a plan that lacks logic?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I reject the proposition in that question. And I do that for a number of reasons. Firstly, because under the current scheme, there are non-government contracts, and that is a very important thing to know. The second thing, though, and I want to challenge the fundamental assumption that things need stay exactly as they are, that they couldn't be better, because all of this questioning is about how things could be better. And they can be better in terms of the assessment system and the way that the experience of families occurs. And how do I know this? Because in the Tune Review, precisely the question that was raised by the member has been addressed. And what is it that David Tune said, one of the most distinguished former public servants that this parliament and this federal government has been privileged to have? Mr Tune said, and I quote, "I consider that to create a seamless aged care system that is responsive to consumer needs and enables the government to fully understand demand, it should be a priority to combine the RAS and the ACAT assessment workforces and systems into an integrated workforce assessment process. It may be preferable to implement this using a staged approach, considering opportunities to trial the integration, for example, in particular rural and remote regions or in jurisdictions."
The Minister will resume his seat. The member for Franklin on a point of order.
It was about privatisation. We agree with streamlining,
but
not
the member for Franklin
privatisation.
will resume her seat. Again, if the member for Franklin repeats that on a point of order in trying to debate the matter, she'll be out of the chamber. The Minister has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And the member for Franklin was asking for the source, the origin, the reason. I'm actually reading the report which recommended that there could be improvements in the existing system. So on the one hand, and I think it's very important to put today into context, on the one hand, they say that change is needed. On the other hand, they oppose change, and then on the third hand, Mr. Each Way and one way and another's approach, they don't even provide any funding. So let me say this: one way, each way. But we are responding directly to David Tune's reports in the very terms that he set out. And so we reject absolutely the presumption. We're also happy to work very constructively with all of the states and territories, work very constructively. But here is a question. Is the opposition now saying it will abolish the existing non-government contracts that are in place for the delivery of these services? Is that a new policy position where they are saying they will abolish the existing non-government contracts? Because that system already exists, and what we are doing is following the recommendations, as we did with the Royal Commission, in this case of David Tune, and we're doing that to protect people and to give them a better chance at getting the care that they need in the right way.
The member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's consistent beliefs and policies are reducing emissions and reducing electricity prices, and is the Prime Minister aware of the costs associated with any alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question and her interest in this issue. At the last election, we took our commitment, our Paris commitment to the last election, to reduce emissions by 26% for 2030, Mr Speaker, but we also went to the last election being able to demonstrate that we were meeting our Kyoto commitments, and those Kyoto commitments this year will be met by 411 million tonnes, Mr Speaker, and exceeding them. And I can also report, because of the policies we have pursued and the embrace we've had of technology, that we've seen emissions fall by 12.8%. Mr Speaker, in the last year, alone on electricity prices, we have seen electricity prices fall by 3.5%, and we've seen record investments in renewables and record take-up of solar panels on the homes and roofs of Australian households. Our position, our policy has been based on very clear targets and proceeding to those targets. And we've had clear guidelines as well. We're not going to reduce emissions by putting up people's taxes. We're not going to do it by pushing up electricity prices, and we're not going to wipe out and roll out extinction, Mr Speaker, of people's jobs in rural and regional communities. Now, Mr Speaker, I wish there was an alternative that the Labor Party might speak of, but there isn't one at present, Mr Speaker. They have no alternative policy when it comes to this issue. So, Mr Speaker, when 20 members of the Labor Party gather at the Otis restaurant, what I'm more mystified by, Mr Speaker, is that they can actually find a consistent position of the Leader of the Opposition that they can actually oppose, Mr Speaker. I'm staggered that they can actually find any consistency in the Leader of the Opposition's policy on emissions or electricity or on coal or any of these things, because he has it each way every day. My advice to those who are meeting down at the Otis regularly is just wait till tomorrow, you'll have another policy. He's going to go odds and evens on climate policy. Joel, the member for Hunter, will agree with it on Monday, Wednesday, Friday and Sunday. And the member for Sydney can have her day on Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday. And as we go around the chamber, they'll all get their go, because he'll agree with every single one of you on every single position you have. And what that says about the Leader of the Opposition is his each way, every day approach to policy, Mr Speaker, is the reason why this Leader of the Labor Party can't be trusted any more than the last one. The last one liked to do dodgy deals around Lazy Susans. This one's just the same, Mr Speaker.
Members on my right. Member for Barker. The member for Maribyrnong.
My question is to the Minister for Government Services. Minister, how many Australians received debt notices issued under the government's illegal Robodebt scheme? How much money are they owed, and when will they be repaid?
The Minister for Government Services.
You put one in again today?
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Let me thank the member for his question. As I responded to the Leader of the Opposition last week, the government announced that it has made a further refinement to the income compliance program, which is part of our ongoing commitment to continually strengthen and improve the scheme. The program has already undergone a number of iterations and refinements since its inception under Labor in 2011. And in response to feedback, these changes will make the program more robust by requiring additional evidence when using information to identify them. We've been carefully and methodically working to identify those customers whose debts may have been calculated using apportioned ATO, PAYG.
The Minister will resume his seat for a second. Members on my left will cease interjecting. I've given the Minister ample time for a preamble. The question itself didn't have a preamble. It asked three very specific questions that asked for figures, essentially. And whilst the Minister can't be expected to have those answers with him, he needs to be relevant to the question or take it on notice. The Minister has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. The process is highly manual in terms of finding the data and complex, as I informed the House.
Members on my left.
And it's not appropriate to preempt that process. And as I advised the House last week, I say the same thing now.
The Minister just paused for a second. Members on my left. I'm just asking. Have you concluded your answer? Yes, I have. Okay. The member for Mallee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is for the Minister for Resources, Water and Northern Australia. Will the Minister outline to the House the importance of the Morrison-McCormack government—
the member will just resume his seat for a second. If members on my left can cease interjecting, I can't hear the question. The member for Mallee will begin her question again.
My question is for the Minister for Resources, Water and Northern Australia. Will the Minister outline to the House the importance of the Morrison-McCormack government's consistent beliefs and policy approach when it comes to supporting our resource sector? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Resources, Water and Northern Australia.
Go easy on him, Go easy on him. Well, thank you for the call, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the honourable member for Mallee, and what a fantastic job the member for Mallee is doing in Victoria, a true local member representing her people. Mr Speaker, under the Coalition's stable economic management, the resources sector is booming. It is booming, generating record exports, royalties and taxes paid by mining companies. Now, Mr Speaker, I'm sure you know this, but the resources sector contributed 8% of Australia's GDP. 8%. Now, I know those opposite like it when I talk about the numbers. I know they're keen on the numbers. But 8% is $279 billion in 2018-19. $279 billion. What a significant contribution to our economy. Now, the sector employed 250,000 Australians at the end of 2018-19. That is 2% of the workforce. 1 in 50. 1 in 50, Mr Speaker. It has been one of the fastest-growing sections of our economy. 94,000 people were employed 15 years ago. That has reached 250,000. It is this section of the economy which is delivering jobs. It is this section of the economy which is lifting our GDP. It is this section of the economy which has got growth, economic advantages. It is this section of the economy in regional Australia which is helping keep our people employed, including those in the member for Mallee's electorate. And, Mr Speaker, I know that my colleagues, like the member hit for Flynn, Ken O'Dowd, the member stands for coal. Resources in his sector employ people and he supports them. The member for Dawson, George stands for coal. We all know that. George stands for coal and the people that are employed in that region. Mr Speaker, it's not just coal exports, $77 billion in iron ore, LNG exports worth $50 billion. But I'm asked about alternative approaches. Mr Speaker. We know that those opposite are not quite that supportive. We know that the Deputy Leader of the Opposition has said he'd be happy if there were no coal exports, if it collapsed. Now, on this side of the House, Mr Speaker, we support the industry. Now, I've said to the Shadow Minister, the member for Hunter, that I'm happy to work with him and the other Shadow Ministers in the interest of the nation. I'm happy to exchange phone calls and exchange texts and exchange emails. I'm happy to meet. I'm even happy to meet him in a social setting, Mr Speaker, a social setting. Now, I'm advised that the member for Hunter has got a regular gig, a regular table. I'm not sure where that restaurant is. I might actually ask for help. Can I ask for help, Prime Minister?
You can. Ask the member for Kingston.
It's the Otis restaurant. It is the Otis restaurant, Mr Speaker. Now, I know that there are 20 seats and 20 people there. I know there's not a seat for the Leader of the Opposition, but if you can squeeze me in, I'm happy to come and talk to you.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. What binding commitment to a percentage of local content did the government write into its contract for the future submarines?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you for the question. Mr Speaker, we all know in this place that the Morrison government is investing a massive $50 billion into our submarine program. The 12 submarines will be built. Good question. Thank you. I'll take that interjection. Built in Australia by Australians and using Australian steel. We're also investing $535 million at Osborne in South Australia to ensure that we can build the submarines right here in Australia. Sovereign control over the attack class submarines and also maximising—
just to pause for a second, and I'm allowing her a preamble which she's had now for 30 seconds. Again, this is a very specific question asking for a specific figure. The minister needs to be relevant, and as I said, she's quite entitled under the standing orders to take the question on notice.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. What we do know in terms of the contract, sovereign control is of course critically important to Australia, as is maximising Australian industry involvement. Mr Speaker, we are currently in the design phase for these submarines, and I'm advised to date there are over 130 Australian companies and organisations that are subcontracted. The actual proportion of Australian content on the submarines, Mr Speaker, will be determined as the design of the submarines is completed. Mr Speaker,
members on my left.
Australian small companies are vital to the
members
construction of our submarines. And I'm committed, the Prime Minister's committed, we are all committed here to building 12 submarines in this country using Australian industry content. We have faith in our Australian industry. We are backing Australian industry. We are building 12 submarines in our country because we are going to create more shipbuilding jobs. Thank you.
The member for Shortland will leave under 94A. And if those sitting with him want to save time, they might go too. It might just save a little bit of time. I'll give them the option. I call the member for Moncrief.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's consistent beliefs and policies on border protection and national security are keeping Australians safe, and is the minister aware of the consequences of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I want to say thank you to— I've got a lot of friends over there, Mr Speaker. Always excited when I come up. It's nice to be back. I want to say thank you very much to the member for Moncrief for her question on a very important topic. And like all members on this side of the parliament, we are absolutely consistent, Mr Speaker, absolutely consistent and strong when it comes to border protection management, as well as in relation to national security. Now, a lot has been said about this Leader of the Opposition, whether he's better or worse than the previous Leader of the Opposition, the member for Maribyrnong. Is he consistent? He's not consistent on different matters. What we know, Mr Speaker, is that when it comes to border protection, there has never been a weaker Leader of the Opposition. We know, Mr Speaker, that on the Alan Jones program, the Leader of the Opposition says, and I quote, "We wouldn't be changing any of the government's policies." And, quote, "I strongly support the measures that the government has in place." But when he leaves the 2GB studio, Mr Speaker, he goes to speak on at that stage to Barry Cassidy on insiders at the time of the ALP National Conference, and this is what the Leader of the Opposition has to say. And it's a very interesting quote. He says, I don't believe the boats will come. I mean, what boats? Boats, what boats? He sat around the cabinet table when 50,000 people came on 800 boats. I mean, what boats could we be talking about? So he goes on to say, Mr Speaker, having just told Alan Jones that he's completely committed to our policies, he says, if people were in a boat, including families and children, I myself couldn't turn that around.
The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. From you. Precious. Have a debate. Have a debate.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition, and I'm just not going to have an argument if you're either seeking the call for a point of order or not. Okay, well, we'll just go on then. The Minister has the call.
So, Mr Speaker, the opposition has had so many policy positions in relation to boats and national security, it's hard to keep up. But I'm interested to know that there is a new policy group that's formed, Mr Speaker. And I was watching Channel 10 News last night, and imagine my surprise, Mr Speaker, when I saw a report about a group of 20 Labor members attending the Otis restaurant. And there was a sense of deja vu because I automatically went back, Mr Speaker, to remember the scene from Muriel's Wedding where you had Bill Hunter go into the restaurant and he ran into Deirdre Chambers, and imagine his surprise, Mr Speaker. Deirdre Chambers. And, you know, I watched Senator Farrell, Mr Speaker, so it wasn't the scene inside the restaurant, it was the one outside where Don Farrell was made up perfectly, makeup on, he runs into PVO. Imagine seeing you here, PVO. But I've got 15 minutes worth of comment to provide to you. I've got 15 minutes of comment to provide. And then Senator Kitching gets caught up in the Senate. I can see PVO in the background winding her up, saying you've spoken for 10 minutes. The package only went for a minute and a half. Mr Speaker, they are all at sea when it comes to policy.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. The contract for Australia's Collins-class submarines included a requirement for 70% local content, which was ultimately exceeded. This government asserted to Australian workers that 90% of the future submarines contract would be local content. So why on earth is there no binding percentage requirement for local content in the government's contract for the future submarines?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you for the question. Mr Speaker, we are delivering a sovereign defence capability, and as I said in my last answer, mandating a minimum portion of Australian industry, particularly at this time during the design phase, would be counterproductive, Mr Speaker. Now, we won't be lectured by those opposite, Mr Speaker. We will not be lectured.
Member for Rankin is warned.
I'd like to know how many submarines those opposite were considering to build. I think it's 0.
100% of 0.
The member for Cowper.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison-McCormack government's consistent policy approach is building resistance for agriculture? Is the Minister aware of risks associated with any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Agriculture has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Cowper for his questions, and can I acknowledge the contribution that the Cowper electorate makes to agriculture, the rich and proud history of agriculture in the Cowper district, and how it is going to contribute to the resilience but also the future of agriculture in meeting its $100 billion goal by 2030. But what, as I heard as I got around the electorate of Cowper and also listening to industry leaders, is they want certainty. They want certainty in their policy formation and execution, particularly in areas like so important to Australian farmers at the moment in drought and even live trade. Let's not forget the reckless actions of those opposite that banned live trade to Indonesia overnight off a television show that trashed a relationship with our nearest and best neighbour. It has taken 10 years of policy formation and execution to rebuild that relationship to a point we have now been able to sign a free trade agreement with Indonesia that will actually benefit those beef farmers, but also broader agriculture, because of the calm and methodical way in which this government has undertaken its policy formation, ensuring we give the certainty not just to our farmers but our international partners. That's what calm, methodical government is about. It's also about the drought, the important aspects of the drought. In fact, actually, I'll take that objection. Let me just also remind those opposite about live sheep. Live sheep, the way that those opposite were going to walk away overnight instead of the calm, methodical approach of science and regulation. They were going to take it away, and the Labor Party in Queensland has a policy resolution to remove all live trade by 2030, destroying agriculture in Northern Australia overnight. That is the reckless approach to those opposites with respect to live trade. But it extends further to that. It extends to drought. Before the election, in one of the lowest political acts in this nation's history, those opposite voted against the Future Drought Fund, a $5 billion fund giving a $100 million dividend a year. The lowest political act of playing on the misery of Australian farmers in the middle of the worst drought. That is one of the biggest kicks Australian agriculture has ever had. It took an election to change their mind. It took the 18th of May election to change their mind. I suspect the member for Hunter played a very contentious part of that. Yes, you did, member for Hunter. It took you that long because of the near-death political experience you had, nearly losing your seat. You came out from underneath that rock you were hiding for 6 years and then finally found a voice, albeit from the confines of the Otis restaurant.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. When hundreds of defence industry workers at Osborne and Adelaide have lost their jobs, and there are reports of another 34 job losses announced today, why on earth is the government sending hull fabrication jobs to France instead of keeping them here in Australia on the future submarines?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you for the question. Mr Speaker, there's currently 4,000 jobs in shipbuilding at this point in time. We need 15,000 shipbuilding jobs. But once again, we will not be lectured to by those opposite. 4,000 jobs now, 15,000 jobs now. And we're working very hard to ensure that we have the skill set in this country to ensure that we have the sovereign capability. We will build those 12 submarines in Australia. We will build the workforce that we need.
The member for Nichols.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister assisting the Minister for Trade and Investment. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's consistent beliefs and policy approach to trade is helping support regional and rural Australians? And is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister has the call.
Very good, Minister.
Hear, hear. Well, I thank the member for Nichols for his question, and I know that he knows firsthand the benefits that greater export opportunities bring to the people of his electorate in terms of greater jobs and greater investment. And we know that the wealth of our nation, Mr Speaker, has to be built on what we make and what we grow and what we sell. And that's why our trade agreements are so very important, because they show in real terms to our young farmers that they have a future, that there are further markets out there to sell their goods. It means that they can not exist under the thumb and the sway of the big supermarkets and be price takers to them. And they show that there is a future in primary production. They help secure its future in primary production. And in 2019, Australia posted our largest ever calendar year trade surplus of $67.6 billion. I know the member for Nichols was very pleased to hear that. And in 2019, Australian good exports rose 13.4% to a record $391.8 billion, with service exports rising 8.9% to a record $101.1 billion. Now, one of the reasons we've been able to do this is because of our trade agreement. Take the TP11. That's eliminated more than 98% of tariffs in the free trade area, including new reductions on Japan's tariffs on beef, and they were as high as 40%, so big gains there. On the 11th of February this year, the Peru-Australia Free Trade Agreement came into force, which will make over 99% of all tariffs on Australian goods to Peru to be ultimately eliminated. And that Peru FTA guaranteed duty-free access for 30,000 tonnes of sugar, which Queensland Sugar said would be filled within the first year. So big opportunities there. And we've also brought into force the Australia-Hong Kong Free Trade Agreement, which will guarantee zero tariffs on Australian goods to Hong Kong. And it's not just the tariffs that we're knocking down, it's the non-tariff barriers as well. So take, for example, export protocols in my area. Once upon a time, if we wanted to export cherries to China, for example, they had to go into cold storage for weeks. But now we've renegotiated those and we can get our cherries straight in, and for the first time this season our exporters have reported solid growth. So we are breaking down those barriers and finding new markets, and we would ask those opposite to join us and support regional Australia and country Australia. And we know that you have an inner-city Green constituency that you want to pander to, and we know that you've got problems with the Otis groups. We know all of that. We know once upon a time you used to dine at the egalitarian restaurants in Chinatown in Sydney, but now it's the highfalutin restaurants of Canberra. Move away from that. Move away from the creme brulee and the fancy restaurants, and come and support regional Australia, and don't wind these trade agreements back because they're benefiting regional Australia.
And I call the member for Macarthur.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, I have dedicated my working life to the health of children. Children with developmental delay and other disabilities, including autism, require a developmental diagnosis to qualify for the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Children in disadvantaged areas are waiting up to 14 months longer than other areas for an NDIS developmental diagnosis. Why?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'll ask the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme to add to my answer. But can I first commend you on the work that you have been doing in that area over a lifetime. I know that area well, and I know the high regard that you're held in particularly in terms of the support you've given to families and for paediatric support in your community. And I understand the reason for the question today and your deep concern about these matters, and I share that concern, and that's why we're providing the support to the National Disability Insurance Scheme to ensure that it can address the very issues that you're raising in this place today so importantly, and I'll ask the Minister to go into those details.
And the Minister has the call.
Yeah, thanks, PM. Thanks, PM, and let me also reinforce the words over Dr Freelander's long career of service. Can I make a number of points on this issue? First of all, when it comes to health diagnosis, we all understand that is responsibility of state health. We can say it is unacceptable in terms of length, but it is absolutely the responsibility of state health authorities. Having said that, a diagnosis is not required for access into the early childhood, early intervention stream of the NDIS. That is quite clear in law and it is quite clear in practice. In terms of access, yesterday's quarterly data showed that people turning up with children seeking early intervention through the early intervention pathways are getting an access decision in 3 days. In 3 days. You don't need a diagnosis to enter the NDIS. And that, of course, is down from over 50 days. In terms of people accessing a plan from Access, it has dropped substantially down to 54 days. Now, anticipating a range of these issues, the Commonwealth leaned in on the second phase of the functional assessment trial, which will conclude this month. All going well with results, and so far they are extraordinarily positive. The Commonwealth will go to market for a functional assessment partner and will introduce functional assessments from 1 July this year to quantify absolutely access to the scheme. But recognising the member's key point, it is important to understand, and it's important for parents in the nation to understand, you don't need a diagnosis to call an early intervention or early childhood early intervention partner. The Act does not require a diagnosis. I encourage all parents Get hold of the NDIS, go to the website, speak to your early childhood, early intervention partner, get that early intervention as quickly as possible. The system is designed for it, and access or request to access is currently 3 days.
The member for Stirling.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General and Minister for Industrial Relations. Will the minister outline for the House the importance of the Morrison government's complete consistency in terms of its approach to national security and to criminal justice, which have enabled it to pass a series of critical reforms designed to keep Australians safe? And is the Attorney aware of any alternative approaches?
The Attorney-General and the Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for his question, for his past contribution to our nation's defence. And as the member is aware, since 2013 the government has passed 19 tranches of national security legislation and a number of other reforms in criminal law. There's been a complete rewrite of all Australia's laws dealing with espionage, sabotage, foreign interference. We've removed abhorrent violent material after the shocking video footage of the Christchurch events was left online. There have been reforms to deal with the sabotage of agricultural products, with trespassing advocates, with counter-encryption. And through all of that, whether it has been about gun trafficking or counter-encryption or boat turnbacks, as the Minister for Home Affairs mentioned earlier, the government's position has always been completely clear, completely consistent and completely supported by every single member on this side of the House. And I'm asked about alternative policy approaches, and consistency has not been a feature of the alternative approaches in this area demonstrated by the opposition. The opposition leader was opposed to boat turnbacks. Now he supports boat turnbacks. In another example, Labor supports mandatory sentencing for people smuggling, but they don't support mandatory sentencing for the smuggling of weapons, even though that is of enormous danger to the health and safety of the Australian public. And I think, Mr Speaker, the Labor policy alternative approach was summarised perfectly by a short statement made by the Leader of the Opposition on Tuesday. And ironically, this statement was made just hours before 20 members of the Labor Party went into the Otis restaurant to discuss policy alternative to the policy of the Leader of the Opposition. But his great statement on unity was this: on our side, we are united. We're committed to doing something to change the country. We are committed to doing something. I mean, it is soaring rhetoric, decisive, inspiring stuff.
The Attorney-General will resume his seat. The member for Barton will cease interjecting. The member for Rankin. You got it? Good. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yeah, relevance.
The Leader of the Opposition resume his seat. I was going to say to the Attorney the question. That was succinct. That's good. Yeah. Okay. I just say to the Attorney that the substance of the question was about a number of policy areas, so he needs to be confining himself to those. The Attorney-General has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We are committed to doing something. The only problem is they don't know what the something is. But we are lucky that we have an alternative policy group meeting at the Otis restaurant, sorting out what the something is.
The Attorney-General will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
The point of order on your rulings being defied. You gave a clear ruling about relevance, and the Attorney-General is proceeding exactly as he was beforehand.
You weren't invited, were you, Bertie? As I said, the Attorney needs to... the Treasurer. Well, the question asked about national security, criminal justice and any alternatives to those. So, the alternative needs to be in the same policy area. It can't just be any other aspect. The Attorney has the call.
And so what, Mr Speaker, is the something on boat turnbacks? What is the something on gun trafficking? Well, at the Otis restaurant, they'll be back, and they'll be back to discuss it. And how do we know that they'll be back? Well, you can look online at the
attorney will
restaurant
resume
reviews.
his seat. The attorney will resume his seat. The manager of opposition business will resume his seat. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition has the call.
My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. The Minister has today admitted that this government chose not to insert a binding local content guarantee in its multi-billion-dollar submarine project. This failure is costing Australian jobs. So why didn't the government provide a guarantee of local jobs in the contract?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thanks for the question. I think it's worth reminding what I've said earlier, which that there is currently 137 Australian companies who are already in the submarine project. We on this side, and I'm sure all of those on the other side, are very committed to ensuring that we have maximum Australian industry content across all of our programs with respect to our $200 billion investment. But, Mr Speaker, as I've said, really, getting this lecture from Labor, it is quite extraordinary. We do know in 6 years Labor did not commission the building of one naval vessel in an Australian yard. Not one naval vessel in an Australian yard. By contrast, Mr Speaker, we are committing 57 naval vessels built in Australia by thousands of Australian workers with Australian steel. As I said earlier, we currently have 4,000 shipbuilding jobs in this country, and we need 15,000.
The Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Thanks, Speaker. On direct relevance, the question goes specifically to there being no Australian content clause in the contract, which the Minister is yet to refer to.
Member for Barton will cease interjecting. I'm just going to say to the Minister she's been entitled to a preamble, but there were two specific aspects to the question. And again, there's always the option to take it on notice. The Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, as I've said, we are currently in the design phase, and it has been very clear from the documentation that once the design, which is a very unique design, highly technical design of these 12 submarines, once that process is finished, we will then negotiate an Australian industry content. In the meantime, the Prime Minister, myself, we on this side, and I'm sure those on that side, we are backing small and medium-sized Australian businesses to ensure we get the maximum Australian industry content, and we are backing Australian businesses all the way.
The Prime Minister. The member for Kennedy's.
Prime Minister, over a year ago you committed to community market gardens. Surely we are judged on how we treat our poorest. Dick Smith, in one shining example, put his own money into market gardens. Cannot tenders be called immediately for experienced, qualified agriculturalists to provide direction and planning so councils can act, employing work for the dole labour and farm? Professor Wronski has volunteered senior nutritionists to advise on combating malnutrition, enabling us to stop stroking lily-pad lefty egos and start saving lives.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. And I agree with the need to proceed with the market garden proposals, as you and I discussed. And in fact, Mr Speaker, back in November of 2018, I wrote to you committing to work with communities in Yarrabah and the Mornington Islands to set up those very market gardens. And I agree with the member that it is so important for the health and well-being of communities, particularly in those areas. Now, the National Indigenous Australians Agency has consulted with Indigenous communities in North Queensland on this proposal. And while there was broad agreement about the concept, I'm sad to say that the community said that the market garden for them wasn't a high priority. That's what they've communicated to us. Now, we remain committed to working with communities in Northern Australia that are interested in building market gardens, and we're prepared to back that up to improve fresh food supply and health outcomes. We support that, and we need to be able to work with those on the ground who are keen to work with us to put those into place. At present, that is not what is being communicated to us by those communities to proceed with those proposals. But I will be very happy, as my ministers will be, to work with those local communities to seek to encourage them to come to that view so we can start working together with them to achieve this very important outcome that you and I both share is an important priority for that area. And in addition to that, I'd say the government has boosted funding for Indigenous specific health initiatives to some $4.1 billion over to 4 years to 22-23, and this is an ongoing increase of around 4% per year. Of this funding, nearly $4 billion is provided through the Indigenous Australians Health Program. About 65% of funding with the IAHP goes to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations. That's 63% to the Aboriginal community-controlled health sector, and over half of the IAHP funds comprehensively provide primary healthcare services, with the ACCHS receiving over 80% of this funding. Mr. Speaker, the member for Kennedy, like the many members that represent North Queensland, I've got to say there are so many members on this side of the House who represent North Queensland, Mr. Speaker. They know what's important on the ground in those communities, Mr. Speaker, and what I find disappointing is that 20 members of the Labor Party have to, Mr. Speaker, gather together in a restaurant somewhere to try and get this leader of the Labor Party to understand what's going on in regional Australia. He doesn't get it. They know he doesn't get it, Mr. Speaker. And I've concluded my answer, and I would ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.